Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Iran and all the latest regarding that country and the tensions that continue in the region, including that with Iran. Today, Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, did speak and gave a Friday sermon, this coming 8 years after his previous sermon on Fridays. It's certainly an important time for the country. He spoke at length about the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, but then also spoke, of course, about the plane and how that was downed, of course, a mistake that has been admitted by Iranian forces at this time. He also then spoke about the JCPOA and the nuclear deal, as well as Europe then bringing forth that dispute mechanism, the fact that Europe cannot at this time be trusted. What does that then mean for negotiations going forward, for example, as the likes of Donald Trump or even Boris Johnson would want to renegotiate or to negotiate altogether a new deal? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Dr. Foad Izadi, who is a professor at the University of Tehran. He's joining us now from the Iranian capital. Dr. Izadi, thank you for your time. What do you make of Ayatollah Khamenei's speech today? Why would he choose, do you think, at this time to speak?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I think he is trying to achieve two goals. One, to present Iran's argument, Iran's logic of thinking when it comes to international relations, the effect of the assassination of General Soleimani, what the European governments did a couple of days ago with regard to basically forcing Iran to leave the nuclear agreement altogether. So the policy issues, I think, is one aspect of what was aimed today. I think the second aspect, or the second aim, was to show the popular support that the Islamic Republic has. We have millions of people attending this Friday prayer, and that huge number by itself is a message to enemies of Iran, United States, Israel, that Iran's government is stable, Iran's government has a broad popular support, and the fact that Iran's government can withstand pressures given this popular support.
He spoke in Arabic in a part of his sermon today. Why do you think he would choose to do that? I mean, he seemed to be addressing the Arab people, certainly, obviously, because he was speaking their language, but he also, within that and otherwise, also mentioned efforts to create rifts between Iranians and Iraqis. As you well know, there has been a lot of criticism towards Iran and Iranian influence in Iraq, both by protesters on the streets in places like Tahrir Square and otherwise.
You know, this is actually a custom, a practice that has been done before. Also, he doesn't lead Friday prayers that often. This was the first time he did this after 8 years. But whenever he does, normally he has a segment that he delivers the speech, the Friday prayer speech in Arabic. He has a message for the Arab publics, the people who are interested to hear what Iranian leaders say. Iran, as you know, has a broad level of support in many different Arab countries. And Arabic, obviously, is a language that many other Muslims throughout the Muslim world understand. They understand Arabic more than they understand Farsi. So that's the second aim. And given the fact that in recent weeks we have had quite a difficult period with regard to the assassination of General Soleimani and assassination of General Abu Mahdi, the fact that the blood of this Iranian general and Iraqi general mixed has these consequences of having a Friday prayer khutbah in Farsi and Arabic at the same time.
Okay, so let's then talk about what his sermon may have meant. Do you think that he has killed off any chances of further negotiations, be it on the JCPOA itself or any other new deal?
You know, Iran has shown in the last many years that Iran doesn't have any problem with negotiating. In fact, Iran's foreign minister negotiated with the U.S. foreign minister more than anybody else. This was a record number of hours that they spent together, and they came up with the nuclear agreement. So Iran doesn't have a problem with negotiations. The only issue is that these negotiations should benefit Iran also, not just the other side. And the fact that Iran gave a lot of concessions in the nuclear agreement and didn't get much out of it is a reason for Iran not to continue that practice. The nuclear agreement was a multilateral agreement, and it is not possible for Iran to unilaterally follow a multilateral agreement.
But to be fair, Dr. Rizvi, if I may come in, because I think it's important to out that, he used very strong language when talking about, and he referred to them as gentlemen around the table, right? Using, in fact, even the word gentleman in the middle of his Farsi speech as well. And he said that, these possibly or at some level are the same as the terrorists that killed the likes of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. That's very strong language. That doesn't really create an atmosphere, does it, which is conducive to talks? You talk, as I was saying, when it's beneficial for your goals. If attacking U.S. bases is going to be beneficial for the country's goals, then that's what you're going to do. You're not going to talk. You're going to send ballistic missiles. Iran tried the first route initially, negotiated with the United States for many days. It took about 2 years to do the negotiations and didn't get much out of it. You had an American president that doesn't think properly, assassinate an Iranian general, and they get ballistic missiles after that. They're not going to get negotiations after that. All right, well, we'll leave there as a final thought. Of course, we do appreciate your time today, Dr. Izadi. That was Dr. Foad Izadi, professor at the University of Tehran, speaking to us there from the Iranian capital. Viewers, the speech of Ayatollah Khamenei today was important because he did speak at length about the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and other issues, be it around the nuclear deal or otherwise. So he didn't really end up saying anything new, but it was significant just for the fact that it took place after 8 years, the fact that he gave a Friday sermon after 8 years. Why did he choose to do it at this time? Certainly a significant enough opportunity for him to speak, and significant enough tensions both within the country and the country's relations with other countries in this region and beyond. We can talk about, of course, its tensions with Iraq, possibly at some level. We know that people in Tahrir Square are critical of Iranian influence, as they would call it. And then, of course, there are those tensions that have played out on Iraqi territory between the United States and Iran with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, and then the Iranian response also. And then there are the Europeans who have then triggered that dispute mechanism within the JCPOA and possibly have even threatened to take this entire thing to the United Nations Security Council. Would that mean a snapback of elections of sanctions, I should say? Ayatollah Khamenei speaking quite harshly and strongly about those European countries, saying they cannot be trusted, something that he has repeated in the past as well. Does this bode well for new talks at all? Will the JCPOA now just fall apart? We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, I'm going to discuss Russia. As you know, the government there of Prime Minister Medvedev has resigned, as well as the entire cabinet. We now have a new prime minister in place. Many people outside of Russia would say that this is, in fact, a power grab once again by Vladimir Putin. Is it as simple as that, though? He does want the president's powers to be seemingly made a bit weaker and to give more power, in fact, to the parliament, as well as a body called the State Council. On the outside, as I said, everyone's talking about the fact that President Putin does need to walk away from his office in 2024. Will he then just want to be head of parliament and or the head of the State Council and therefore continue to exercise power in the country in a fashion that he has been for many, many years? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Pavel Luzin, who is a PhD in international relations, is an expert in Russia's foreign policy and defense. He's joining us now from Perm in Russia. Joining us from Moscow is Daria, who is a research fellow at the University of St. Andrews. She's an expert in how foreign policy decisions in Russia link to the domestic socio-political considerations of the Kremlin. And also joining us from the Russian capital is Dmitry Babich, who is a journalist and a well-known political commentator as well. Dmitry, Daria, and Pavel, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Daria, let me start with you. What do you make of the resignation of Prime Minister Medvedev and the entire cabinet?
Well, this is obviously only the result of discussions with Putin before. I think we have to start from why did it happen at all? Why Putin decided it? Because obviously it's not Medvedev just resigning on his own. Of course, Putin prepares his end of term, and he wants to still be in power, but not as a president after 2024. And obviously, to do this, he needs to secure his power in a new way, because the previous way, when he switched with Medvedev, wouldn't work. It would cause too much negative feelings in Moscow and in Russia, because people wouldn't approve it, and Medvedev wasn't such a popular president either. So Putin needs to find new ways, and obviously giving more power to the Security Council and to this State Council, he can do that.
Okay. Dmitry, what do you make of this? Is it, as many people outside of Russia are calling it, a power grab?
No, I don't think it's a power grab, because Putin already has power. And I think that if he wanted more power, he should have sacked Medvedev 2 years ago. When Putin won the presidential election with a landslide in 2018, there was a lot of speculation that if people vote for Putin, he would dismiss the government, because the government was unpopular. And I mean, it's still working, so it is unpopular. Especially Medvedev. The problem is that Medvedev is not a very kind person. At least that's the image that he projected. He never met, for example, with victims of disasters or military actions, something that Putin does on regular basis. Medvedev did not project any kind of sympathy for a lot of people who had problems, who suffered. You know, he became a target of a lot of jokes with his liberal, or rather neoliberal, statements about the need, for example, for museum workers to make money on, developing their connections to business. So Medvedev was very unpopular, and if Putin wanted more power, he should have sacked him 2 years ago, and everything would be fine, and he could appoint a new government that get more popularity. Okay. But the reason why Putin kept Medvedev for 2 more years, I think, is Putin wanted financial stabilization before he starts a new policy that would allow the Russian economy to expand.
All right, so if I may just go to Pavel for a moment. Pavel, I want to get your thoughts on that as well, because the prime minister that we now have in place in Russia is a man that, as much media around the world likes to say, didn't even have a Wikipedia page till just a few days ago. Why bring in somebody who is so unknown into that very important position?
So it is not the first time when an unknown person becomes a Russian prime minister. So I think that here Putin tries to consolidate a whole ruling class around him. And he still keeps Medvedev near him in Security Council. He decided to make Mishustin, who previously was the head of Russian Fiscal Authority for 10 years. So Putin tries to consolidate ruling class. And that's why Putin made this de facto constitutional coup in Russia.
All right, so Daria, let's talk for a moment about fashion. This is going to take place because Putin has almost laid out a plan to an extent where he said that all of these changes that may occur will need to be okayed by the Russian people. That's quite a positive step, isn't it? Because in the sense that if the Russian people themselves are going to democratically be able to vote on these changes, why is the rest of the world so worried about this then, do you think?
Yeah, we obviously have to remember that last year now wasn't very easy for the Russian government. There were some protests against the government and against the regime, and Putin's popularity as well was decreasing. So he had to introduce some changes which would make people more happy about his government. Either he would need to change himself, which is not possible at the moment, or he had to implement some big changes, which he did. And I think Mishustin is a very, if I can say, very logical choice for Putin, because Putin seems to choose not very charismatic leaders, but the ones who are very loyal to the government and at the same time who know how to do things and how to organize what they have to do. Mishustin is similar to Shoigu or to Sobyanin, the mayor of Moscow, who are really good in place and who don't get too much attention or popularity among people. And in terms of people will have more voice, yes, it's obviously needed, because if you think about protests in Moscow and Russia last year, people were quite dissatisfied that the government was controlling too much, and people didn't have much voice.
Dmitry, I wonder what role you think Russia's foreign policy is playing in what the issues the country may be facing domestically as well, because we do have very real sanctions in place, for example, against Russia, continuing pressure, for example, from NATO. So, all of that does have an effect, doesn't it, within the country and politics within?
Well, it has if you talk about the Western sanctions, it certainly has the opposite effect to the one that was desired by the United States and the European Union when they imposed these sanctions. Because President Obama was completely wrong when he said that Russian economy is in tatters. He said that soon after introducing the sanctions, and he was laughed at in Russia because, nothing changed after the sanctions were introduced. Part of the reason was because it takes some time for sanctions to have effect. The other reason is because Russian economy was so open by the so-called liberals back in the 90s to the world economy that basically some protectionism would be good for Russia and was good for Russia. So when protectionism came in the form of Western sanctions, several sectors of Russian economy started to develop much faster, such as the food industry, for example. As for foreign policy, I have been reading in 5 languages hundreds of comments from around the world, from the Western newspapers, in French, in English, in German, and they were all saying that Putin wants to stay in power. It's a power grab. I read the same headlines everywhere as if some Soviet censor was ordering it.
Yeah.
And this is profoundly wrong, because I think the Western experts, they have talked themselves into believing that Putin is the only problem between Russia and the West, that if you just remove Putin, that particular man, there would be some kind of a breakthrough in relations, that Putin is responsible for the worsening of relations. No, the West's own policy is largely responsible for that. No one forced the West to start the regime change in Ukraine. No one forced the West to intervene in Syria, trying to produce a regime change there. And in Syria, the West just lost. It was not because Putin was so smart.
On that point, Dmitry, if you allow me, I wanted to give your response to that, because it's a very appropriate thing that Dmitry said there, isn't it, Pavel, where it does seem, for much of the Western media and Western governments, that Putin himself, just that one man, is the problem standing in the way of a takeover of Russia and or better relations. Is it as simple as that?
Firstly, I completely disagree with my colleague Dmitry, because, let's remember one of the top priorities that Prime Minister Mishustin announced yesterday was defense industry. Medvedev in Security Council will be responsible for defense industry. So Russia's course to self-isolation, Russia's course to aggression will become a part of Russian constitution. The concept of Fortress Russia will be part of Russian constitution. And moreover, why there is so many attention to defense industry? Because defense industry is in deep crisis currently in Russia. Yes, a lot of money, a lot of acquisitions program, but nevertheless a lot of losses inside the industry. So Russian government, Russian authorities, Kremlin will face a problem how to keep all the system in order, how to manage all the system. And of course, towards, for example, foreign policy, I'm afraid there will not be a calm time for Russian neighborhood in such a way, because Russia will need to balance this very sophisticated system also through more proactive, maybe more aggressive foreign policy.
Okay, so Daria, I'll give you the final word. What do you make of Putin? Is it just as simple as saying Putin, if Putin were to step down, everything will be fine and rosy? And then what do you make of the fact, as Pavel there said, about the defense and the need for stronger defenses, possibly on the part of Russia, with this perceived threat of NATO expansionism?
Well, I disagree with my colleague Pavel. I think, yes, defense system is extremely popular for Russia. I mean, Russian defense has to be very strong because NATO is seen as a threat, and because post-Soviet space is seen as a sphere of Russian influence, and Russia is not going to change its mind on this point. But at the same time, it's not about Putin. I think Putin is not against the West. It just wants Russia. I think he does believe that Russia needs to be strong and to develop it in its own way, and it should be given time to do so. And for this, both defense and foreign policy should work accordingly.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that. Appreciate, of course, all three of you for your time and your insight today. That was Pavel speaking to us from Perm in Russia, and Daria and Dmitry were speaking to us from Moscow, respectively. Viewers, the Russian government did resign, that is, of Prime Minister Medvedev. Major changes have been brought in. And now we have a new Prime Minister, Mikhail Mishustin. He's an unknown figure. As I said just a number of days ago, he didn't even have an English Wikipedia page yet. He may very well be able to do Putin's bidding, if that's what we're understanding from what the Western media is saying, at least. Or is it not that simple? Why would Putin want to lessen the powers of a president? Is he, in fact, planning for a takeover of power through parliament, if he were to be brought there, and or the state council? How does all of this work as far as foreign policy also goes, relations with NATO, etc.? Is it as simple as Dmitry there said as well about just Putin leaving power and then everything just falls into place magically? That would possibly just be a very naive look at Russia-West relations if we're looking at this through that prism. We'll keep a close eye, of course, on how that develops there in Russia. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss the Trump impeachment, which still continues, but now we are in the Senate, finally. The Senate trial will begin soon. As we know, the House has passed on those articles of impeachment to the Senate. That formal process has now taken place. Chief Justice John Roberts will be presiding, over that entire process. Senators have taken their oaths that they will impartially impart justice, if I may say it in that fashion. And we now have new revelations as well about Rudy Giuliani and how he's been handling this entire situation with Ukraine in the past. How does all of that affect what is to happen? Most would say, listen, the Senate's never going to actually indict Donald Trump at this point because it is controlled by the Republicans. But nevertheless, it continues to stain the president, doesn't it? And what does this then mean for the upcoming elections? Because all the senators, too, would want this to end quickly so they can get back to then campaigning and possibly win their respective elections as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Michael Lane, who is the founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. Joining us from New York is David Andelman, who is a CNN commentator, journalist. He's also author of A Shattered Peace, Versailles 1919, and The Price We Pay Today. He's a former New York Times and CBS News correspondent as well. We're also joined by Haley Wilson, who is joining us from Dublin. She is an American politics and foreign policy analyst. Haley, David, and Michael, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Haley, let me start with you. What do you make of the fact that now we are in the Senate finally, and the trial will begin soon? Is this all, if I may use this term, a bit of a waste of time? Because we all sort of know what the end result is, right? Or is it, as Nancy Pelosi says, we're trying to make a point that no one is above the law?
So I do understand the claim that people do think this is a waste of time because there is a clear majority in the Senate that would favor the GOP Republicans. However, this process is really different compared to other parts of impeachment. Senators sit at their desks without electronics. They are not allowed to do anything other than listen to the trial in front of them. And they take this oath to administer impartial justice. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will be devoid of bias in this process. However, it really forces them to look at the facts up close and personal. And there are plenty of moderate Republicans who would look at the evidence and see that there is an area where there is reasonable doubt that the president is innocent. So I think that the burden of proof right now is really lying on the GOP to produce a claim that this really isn't true, that the Les Parnas claims and the new evidence that has come forward really isn't significant. However, time has really favored the Democrats. Nancy Pelosi was withholding the articles because she knew, maybe didn't know, but she had an inkling that there would be more evidence that was forthcoming, which has been proven time and time again in this process. And it's paid off. But we'll see really if that patience is going to benefit the process overall, or if, like you said, this is really just going to end up being a waste of time.
David, what are your thoughts on that? Because I imagine, obviously, those who support the Republican Party would dispute what Haley there said about, Pelosi delaying sending these articles of impeachment to the Senate. That was certainly a risky tactic, wasn't it?
Well, it was to a certain extent, but she really has focused the whole attention of the United States and the world during this period. She has not been just sitting idly by while all this happens. It's interesting. I was watching the actual proceedings live yesterday on television because it was broadcast nationwide and worldwide, really, on cable channels. And it really is quite an extraordinary moment. This is an historical moment. And I am wondering, and I think a lot of people are beginning to wonder, whether a lot of moderate Republicans, as Haley mentioned, won't be looking at this and saying, looking beyond all of this and saying, this is a moment in history. This is how we are going to be judged. How did we vote on Donald Trump? How did we react to this whole system and situation? And it's not entirely impossible that quite a number, or at least a certain number, won't find themselves changing sides and saying, we've looked at the facts now. Let's see what happens. It's very interesting because a lot of these people, remember, were out campaigning. They were doing Senate business, other business, while this whole process was going on, with all the hearings, all the testimony, all the evidence being presented in the House, and they didn't really focus on this. All of a sudden now, they see all this laid out and more, because more has come along since the actual indictment by the House. And they may very well be looking at this and saying, gosh, there really is more to this than meets the eye or met my eye initially. And this could have a very important, I think, impact eventually on the whole gestation of this process in the Senate.
That's interesting. Michael, what are your thoughts on, because as David there said, and I believe there was a senator who did mention that she or he would rather be out campaigning than be stuck in the Senate during this process, of course. And that makes sense because, the elections are upcoming and every day, every moment does count when it comes to a campaign trail. Do you think that in some way that this may very well be sort of quickened and fast forwarded so that the elections can that all of these senators can go back to electioneering?
Yeah, I believe it was Bernie Sanders who was quoted as saying that he would rather be on the campaign trail, but he had sworn an oath as a senator of the United States, and so he was going to remain in the Senate for the duration. I'm not here to defend President Trump. I have my issues with President Trump, but I could not disagree more with my two colleagues here. This is not a solemn moment. This is not a historical moment. This is an embarrassing moment for the United States. We're going through a political process that has no foundation laid to it. And it's a circumstance that really we're showing to the world how dysfunctional our government has actually become. And I don't think that's a good thing for the United States. I don't think it's a good thing for United States citizens. And I certainly don't think it's a good thing for the world to see this. We talked about this new guy, Parnas, who comes forward with his new information. This is a guy whose credibility level is 3 steps below Michael Avenatti. There's just nothing to see here. Now, as far as how it's going to play out, I expect it to be very much like the Clinton one. It'll go about 2 weeks, maybe 2.5 weeks. And at the end of that, the president will be acquitted. There are no hidden moderate Republican senators that are going to turn on President Trump, no matter what the evidence is. The evidence is, for the most part, going to be limited to that which was developed by the House of Representatives. They're the ones that were responsible for putting the case together, and they will bring their case. But there will not be these outside distractions and things like that. At the end of the day, we talk about these senators who were sworn in to issue impartial justice or whatever. Look, there are 100 United States senators. I could sit here today and I could tell you how each and every of those 100 are going to vote at the end of the trial. And I would bet any of my colleagues or anyone else that I would be 98% or more correct in predicting how they're going to vote. This is scripted, and it's comedic theater, but it's bad.
But Michael, to be fair, before I go to Haley, do you think that at some level Donald Trump did try to obstruct justice?
No, I don't know. That didn't try to obstruct justice. No, I mean, their charges on obstruction of Congress are that they requested documents from him. He said, I don't think I need to give these to you. We're going to go to court and argue this out, and the judges will decide whether or not that is whether I'm legally obligated to give you these documents. And they said, oh, well, you're obstructing Congress because you want to go to court. That's not the American way. I think Haley said, that the senators will look at this and they'll say there's a reasonable doubt as to what Donald Trump did. Well, in our system, if there's a reasonable doubt, you're acquitted.
Okay. Let me just go to David first with you, Haley. I know David wanted to say something. David, go ahead and react.
But I think the embarrassment is exactly what Michael was saying. I think the whole concept that's embarrassing is the fact that the Republicans have scripted this. They have said, you have to fall into line behind this. You cannot. You are actually going to violate the oath which you took yesterday, which was to look objectively at everything that's been done here. That is the real embarrassment in this. The actual impeachment itself is not an embarrassment. It is it's a great tribute to the American system, to the system that the constitutional fathers set up back in the 18th century. This is a system that should work. In other words, if a president has committed a crime, which is quite clear, I think that Donald Trump has committed in so many respects, not even in this, but let's focus on this. If he has committed a crime, he needs to be held accountable to it, and he needs to be brought up before an objective jury, which should be what the Senate is. And unfortunately, the Senate does not seem to be moving in that direction.
Haley, what are your thoughts on this? Because, the one thing that comes out from this, and I'm looking at this obviously from the outside in, is that this has been a very partisan issue from day one, really, hasn't it?
Yeah, one of the biggest things we need to look at is the partisan politics at play. I agree with both my colleagues when they say that this is an embarrassment to the political establishment, but is it also not an opportunity for the United States to prove that it has a democracy that's functioning? If the president did commit a crime, if he is guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors, is this not an opportunity for democracy to exercise itself? If that's true, then the Senate will convict Donald Trump. If not, then he's innocent. And we do not permit crimes against double jeopardy in the United States. So we have to assume that he's been acquitted at that point. At which point, Democrats may or may not decide to still continue to chase this down. That'll be kind of a defining factor for the Democrats as well. I don't think that this entire process is really painting American democracy in an exceptional light. we have to kind of put our opinions aside and look at the fact that this is really a pivotal moment for American democracy, especially the impeachment process, and especially the relationship between the three branches. See if checks and balances are really going to be effective.
Okay, so Michael, let me go to you, because you've said as well, Michael, that there are a lot of things that one does not like about Donald Trump, speaking even objectively, really. What do you think it is about Trump that has brought on so much of this sort of heat onto himself? I mean, he has a role to play in all this. What do you think his role has been here?
Well, okay, so if you look at this in political terms, Donald Trump is an abrasive New Yorker who does not play well throughout the rest of the country. The colloquialism in America is he doesn't play in Peoria, which is a Midwestern town in Illinois, supposedly representative of what the United States is about. Also, Donald Trump won an election he was not supposed to win. Donald Trump is an outsider, does not play well with the establishment. In fact, annoys and offends the establishment, not on a day-to-day basis, but on a minute-to-minute basis. And Donald Trump has been fairly successful in implementing his agenda. All these things engender a great deal of beyond dissatisfaction, but actually anger at him. And the Democratic base got out of control. Speaker Pelosi, for a long time, was able to say, no, we're not going to go down this road. Impeachment is so serious. It needs to be bipartisan. There needs to be a lot of buy-in. The public needs to be behind it. And she lost control of her caucus, lost control of her party, and was forced into the impeachment mode when it didn't even meet the same standards that she had set for herself. So now we're in a situation where, it is, unfortunately, as I said, it's comedic theater. We know it's going out. After the House voted to send the articles of impeachment over, they were laughing. They were swapping high fives with each other. They were patting each other on the back. And then Pelosi came over and said, okay, guys, we got to get solemn and walk these things across. And all of a sudden, the total personality changed. They walked across the Capitol like they were in a funeral procession. It's bad theater.
Okay, David, I'll give you the final word. We're under a minute and a half left. Pelosi did want this to be a bipartisan process. That has not occurred, has it?
Well, no, first of all, I'd like to make two corrections. Hallie, I did not think this was an embarrassment to American democracy. I never said that, and I never would. I think, in fact, it's a ratification of the democratic process that he can, in fact, be indicted, impeached, and perhaps not removed, but at least certainly held to account. Second of all, Donald Trump does not play well in Peoria. I'm terribly sorry. He is, and they're not in many other places anymore as well. Donald Trump may once have played well in certain narrowly in a few states that got him elected, like particularly like Pennsylvania and Michigan, and Wisconsin, but not in Peoria. At any rate, look, Nancy Pelosi has done a great service to the United States. She has shepherded a very difficult process through the House. Would I have liked to see this play out a little bit more slowly in the House so that some of this other material that has come to light since then could, in fact, have been rolled in more readily into the whole democratic process? Yes, but it didn't. And so now we're faced with a situation where the Senate is going to have the final say, and hopefully it will do its appropriate duty.
All right, and we're going to, of course, keep a very close eye on this, but we appreciate all three of you for your time and the context you've provided to this discussion. That was Michael speaking to us from Washington, David speaking to us from New York, and Haley, who was speaking to us there from Dublin. Viewers, this is a complicated process, but not complicated. It depends on how you look at this, really. Nancy Pelosi wanted this to be bipartisan. It's not bipartisan. It's very, very just partisan at this point in time, Democrats versus Republicans in a very real, obvious fashion. Is it just the fact that Democrats want to win these upcoming elections, or is this essentially just them looking to actually really hold criminal acts done by this president, quote-unquote criminal acts, I should say, within brackets and quotation marks? They're trying to hold him to justice, or is this, again, as I said, just about the elections? Donald Trump says this has been a witch hunt from day one. We can talk about Russia collusion and otherwise. This will not probably go through in the Senate. He won't be indicted. Nevertheless, he goes down in history as the third only president of the United States to ever be impeached by the House. That's enough of a stain, though, isn't it? And yet, many people are saying he may very well still be reelected for a second term. What does that say about the U.S.? What does that say about divisions within the U.S.? What does all of this say about American democracy, as Haley had also brought up? We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.